Welcome everybody to the Institute for Government. Thanks for joining us today. Our topic for today is how Prime Ministers lead, looking back to Gladstone and Disraeli and then continuing through to the present day. We have a very distinguished panel with us. I'll introduce them in a moment. I should start though with Lord Andrew Adonis, who won't get an introduction now because he's late. However, he is... Exactly. I'm sure I don't need to introduce him anyway. He is on his way. He should be here in the next 5 or 10 minutes, so he'll come and join us when he's ready. So I'll start then introducing our panel from the left. First we'll have Dick Leonard. Dick is a former MP and journalist and has been written widely on Prime Ministers. He's written books on Prime Ministers in the 18th, the 19th and the 20th century, I believe. And most recently on Gladstone and Disraeli in particular. He's going to start us off talking a bit about not just how they led, but how they came to lead. We will then turn to the rest of the panel, beginning with Andrew if he arrives on time. And then over to my right. First we have Professor Jane Ridley from the University of Buckingham. Jane is an expert on late 19th century and early 20th century political history, particularly the Conservative Party. The young Disraeli, I believe you had a book on, but also more recently she's got a book out on Edward VII. And also, I said to her earlier on, I saw her only last week where she suddenly popped up in Biarritz introducing Michael Portillo to the delights of that particular town, but you know, no particular relevance to today. And then to my far right, we have Professor Stein Ringen, who is a sociologist and professor of social policy. He was a Norwegian civil servant and then journalist before coming over to grace these shores and give us his expertise, and he will hopefully be particularly bringing us up to the present day and thinking about some of the lessons that we might be able to take for today's government. So that's our panel, and if I could start then with Dick Leonard. Dick, please do introduce us to the topic.
Well, thank you very much. I'm just going to make a very few remarks, not at all at this stage about Gladstone and Disraeli as Prime Ministers, but how they, both of them, climbed to the top of the poll. I hope I may be able to make some remarks about their Prime Ministerships later during the course of the discussion. The first point I want to make is that both of them were extremely improbable people to become Prime Ministers at all. Disraeli was born a Jew. If he remained a Jew, it would have been quite impossible for him to have had a political career because Jews were not allowed to take their seats in the House of Commons to 1858. But fortunately for him, his father Isaac, who was a member of a very orthodox synagogue in the city of London, had a big row with this synagogue, walked out in a huff, and though he never converted to Christianity himself, had all his 3 children, including the 12-year-old Benjamin, baptised into the Church of England. Gladstone had a somewhat similar handicap. He was very different from Disraeli in many ways, but he was the son of a self-made businessman who made a large fortune mainly on the basis of the slave trade. He owned 1,609 slaves, and when slavery was abolished in the British Empire in 1833, he received over £76,000 in compensation from the British government, and Gladstone, who was a newly elected MP, was forced by his father to make his maiden speech on this subject, not criticising the emancipation of the slaves, but criticising the relatively low amount of compensation that the slave owners received, which was not a very auspicious beginning for a man who was later to become leader of the Liberal Party. The second point, and it's probably the most salient about their rise to the top in politics, was that during the period when they were young men on the rise, it was a period of continual hung parliaments between 1846, when the Tory party was split, over the abolition of the Corn Laws, and 1857 when the newly formed Liberal Party achieved a majority in the election. So for a period of over a decade, there was no majority in House of Commons. And this, in fact, represented the pinnacle of the power and influence of Parliament. During this time, it was Parliament and not the monarch or the electorate who decided who should form the government and who the members of that government should be. And it was they who decide if and when that government should be dismissed and replaced by a different team. All the governments during this period were either minority governments or coalitions. It's not surprising that the politicians who thrived during this period were those who make the most effective speeches in Parliament. In this respect, Gladstone and Disraeli were head and shoulders above all their rivals in the House of Commons. Their only rival as a parliamentary orator was the 14th Earl of Derby, but he was in the House of Lords, so they were not completely directing against him. It was not only their general competence as speakers that marked Disraeli and Gladstone out. Each of them built his own reputation on the basis of a spectacular destruction of a rival. Disraeli by his brutal attacks on Sir Robert Peel during the Corn Law debates, which drove Peel out of office and also out of the Tory party. When Peel left the Tory party, he took with him virtually all the Tory MPs of any ability whatsoever, leaving a rump of about 300 country squires, none of whom had any particular intellectual distinction or aspiration. The ones who left, of course, included Gladstone himself. If Disraeli established himself, and this left the field open for Disraeli rapidly to become leader of the Tories in the House of Commons. He had no significant rival, and he held this position for a very long time and eventually succeeded Derby as the overall leader of the party. Now, if Disraeli established himself by his destruction of Sir Robert Peel, Gladstone achieved the same objective by his discomfiture of Disraeli. This event, which forms the prologue to my book, was a budget debate in December 1852, when Disraeli was Chancellor of the Exchequer and leader of the House of Commons in the first of the three minority Tory governments that the Earl of Derby led. It was a highly ingenious budget, but the sums did not really add up. And on a highly dramatic occasion, Gladstone proceeded to a forensic dissection of the budget proposals in all their details, and succeeded in persuading every member of the House of Commons, except the members of the Tory party, that they were ill-considered and unworkable. The budget was defeated, and within a few days, the government resigned, and a new government formed, a coalition of Whigs and Peelites under the premiership of the Earl of Aberdeen. Gladstone himself was appointed Chancellor of the Exchequer almost purely on the basis of his destruction of Disraeli, and for the first time he was looked upon as a potential Prime Minister. I'd like to say a few words about the two men, why the two men went into politics in the first place. Gladstone, who was elected for a pocket borough at the age of 22, was a man with a mission. This was to defend the principles and the privileges of the established church, the Church of England. At the same time, he embraced a number of extreme right-wing causes, being described by Lord Macaulay as the rising hope of those stern, unbending Tories. Gladstone remained a man with a mission, or a conviction politician, as Mrs. Thatcher put it, but the nature of his mission changed. He was greatly influenced by two older men who acted as his mentors. One was the Earl of Aberdeen, under whom he served as Under-Secretary in the short-lived government of Sir Robert Peel in 1834 to 1835. Aberdeen was the only Prime Minister in the 19th century, other than the Duke of Wellington, who had personal experience of war. As a young man, he witnessed the Battle of Leipzig in 1813, when the remnants of Napoleon's Grande Armée was overwhelmed by the combined armies of Austria, Russia, Prussia and Sweden in a particularly bloody battle which continued for 3 days. He became a convinced advocate of diplomacy and international arbitration as a means of settling disputes, and he passed on his convictions to Gladstone. Gladstone's second great mentor was Peel himself, who turned Gladstone into a fanatical free trader. And if he did not make him the liberal that he eventually became, at least turned him into the cautious centrist politician he was to be in the middle period of his career. Other missions came later: fiscal responsibility, the superiority of merit to patronage in the public sector, and Irish Home Rule. When he was appointed Prime Minister for the first time in 1868, he uttered his famous words, "My mission is to pacify Ireland." Disraeli's motivations were quite different. When he was 17, he decided his main objects in life were fame and wealth, and he started out by trying to make a quick fortune through gambling on the stock exchange with money he didn't have. He went on as a 20-year-old to launch a newspaper to rival the Times, in partnership with the publisher John Murray and another business associate. This crashed ignominiously, leaving him with enormous debts, which he still had not repaid 25 years later. Then he wrote a series of scandalous novels, which enjoyed only a modest success and relatively little financial reward. Only at the age of 27 did he think of politics as a career, but had some difficulty in deciding which party to support. He disliked the Whigs and feared that the Tories were a lost cause after their stubborn resistance to the Great Reform Bill. So he offered himself to the electorate of Wickham, where his father lived, as an independent radical on 3 separate occasions. He then switched to the Tories, unsuccessfully fighting a by-election in Taunton, and finally, at the age of 32, became MP for Maidstone at his 5th attempt. Even then, his main motive was not political, but to gain immunity from imprisonment for debt. He had no clear political programme, but had not completely abjured his radical sympathies and was seen as pretty firmly on the extreme left wing of the Tory party, while Gladstone, who had preceded him into Parliament by 5 years, was solidly on the right. Later, Disraeli developed his own political philosophy based on romantic ideas of an alliance between the aristocracy and the workers against the money-grubbing middle classes, combined with a realpolitik approach to foreign affairs. I've been asked whether either Gladstone or Disraeli would have made it to the top if they were active in politics today. About Gladstone, I would have serious doubts. He was a superbly capable minister, but his whole style would have jarred with modern sensibilities. His extreme religiosity and the inordinate lengths of his speeches would have counted very much against him, and I wonder how good he would have been on television. What is certain is he would not have got away with his midnight prowling and the ostensible purpose of reforming prostitutes. He would have been crucified by the tabloid press. There's been nobody in British politics for a very long time who remotely resembled Gladstone. The latest was probably Stafford Cripps, who died 60 years ago. Someone once said of Stafford Cripps that there for the grace of God goes God. My son, Mark Leonard, who's in the audience today, claims to see similarities between Gladstone and Tony Blair, there may be something in this, but I think the differences were a great deal more than the resemblances in that case. Dizzy is a different matter altogether. I suspect that his quick-wittedness and his sparky humour would have made him a natural television star, and his basic message might well have resonated with a modern audience. Douglas Hurd has recently compared Dizzy with Boris Johnson, who I had the opportunity of observing at close quarters in the 1990s when we were both foreign correspondents in Brussels reporting on the EU. It will not surprise you to learn that we wrote very different accounts of the EU for our respective newspapers. Boris was then in his 20s, and the resemblance to the young dissolute Disraeli was fairly obvious. He is now 49 years old. Disraeli, by this age, had acquired a fair amount of gravitas. With the best will in the world, I cannot see much evidence that Boris has done the same.
Thank you, Dick. Yes, Tony Blair as Gladstone and Disraeli as Boris Johnson, that's certainly food for us all to debate later on. Jane, if I could turn to you first, how do you see these two figures?
Well, I thought that was a fascinating introduction from Dick. And I just wanted to sort of respond to one point. Because you were arguing basically that Gladstone wouldn't have had a hope in hell if he was a politician today, but Disraeli might well have been very successful. But if you look at a 19th century context, I would suggest that really the question is the other way about. Because to the Victorians, the obvious successful political leader was Gladstone, and the complete, bizarre, inexplicable outsider was Dizzy. I mean, if you look at their political records, if you sort of try and assess the success of their leadership, you know, score it against each other, we have the fact that, Disraeli, okay, he was leader in the House of Commons and then eventually of the party, altogether for 32 years. But he delivered incredibly little over that period. As party leader, he won one election over 32 years. The rest of the time, his party was in a minority. He was Prime Minister twice, but the first time for a minority, I mean, he did achieve a good measure, the Reform Bill, but, you know, only one good government. He had no record of competence, of administrative or fiscal competence. His budget, the 1852 budget, as Dick pointed out, was a complete disgrace, fiasco. And it was quite extraordinary that he recovered from that, actually, from being savaged by Gladstone in Parliament in 1852. He himself had enormous personal debts, as Dick said, and again, somehow that didn't sink him. And as Prime Minister from 1874 to 1880, Disraeli he was too old, and he admitted that. His health was poor. He spent most of his premiership in a sort of comatose state, heavily dependent on self-medicating with laudanum. And there's plenty of research which has shown that the measures that he actually were introduced under him as Prime Minister were really not sponsored by him at all. He just agreed and nodded through the important Tory measures, which were social reform and imperialism. So Disraeli's record is really not frightfully good. And let's compare Gladstone. Gladstone, as leader, he is a leader of his party, the Liberal Party, for 27 years. Bit shorter than Dizzy. But within that period, he wins two really good elections, 1868 and 1880. He also takes office in two hung parliaments, in 1886 and 1892. He is Prime Minister 4 times, and he has 2 really good administrations, particularly the administration, the Great Administration of 1868 to 1874, which is one of the great reforming governments of the 19th century. And one of the sort of touchstones of 19th century political leadership success was really reform. And by reform, you know, they weren't interested in welfare in the 19th century. By reform, they meant institutional reform, which is something we've rather forgotten about today. Not only did they reform Parliament, and I'm sure they'd have had a go at the House of Lords if they were around today, the Victorians. But they also reformed, the army, the church, the civil service, everything, institutional reform. And Gladstone was incredibly good at this. And above all, Gladstone's achievement was fiscal reform. Building on Peel, as Dick has said, Gladstone brilliantly starred as Chancellor of the Exchequer in the 1850s and 1860s. And as Chancellor of the Exchequer, well, he made that job the central job of domestic politics. And, more than that, he really shifted the whole basis of 19th century finance, Gladstonian fiscal orthodoxy. Low tax, small government, no redistribution, fiscally neutral state, and very limited expenditure on any kind of social reform. And that was Victorian fiscal orthodoxy, and that was Gladstone's achievement. Disraeli really doesn't hold a candle to this. Gladstone in his governments dominates the domestic agenda, as I think Professor Jones can tell us later, whereas Dizzy, as I said, is asleep through most of the cabinet meetings. So how is it that it seems to me, one of the great questions is, how is it that Disraeli hangs on for so long? Whereas Gladstone, who's this Victorian political genius, today we might think he's, I don't know what we do with him today, we'd probably put him in a lunatic asylum. But then, with this massive sort of turbulent energy, Gladstone was dynamite. I think that, what does Disraeli have? Like Gladstone, he is a great performer in the House of Commons. He's a star debater, and the importance of the Commons as a forum, not just during the period of hung parliaments after Peel breaks the Tory party in 46, but right up, really, until the constitution or procedural reforms of the Edwardian period, which mean that governments always win debates and governments control the time all the time, up until about 1900. The Commons really is the forum where things are decided, and both of them can dominate in that forum. Gladstone, though, has the advantage that he can reach out, much more than Dizzy, to the new audience, which is developing in late 19th century, early 20th century politics, which is the people. Not for nothing is Gladstone called the People's William. Gladstone can, he can engage, enchant, and mesmerise a mass audience. They couldn't understand a word he said. This sort of torrent of obscure verbiage. But, what he said was, I breathe in the vapour of the people. It sounds as though they smelt rather bad. But anyway, I breathe in the vapour and I give them a torrent of oratory. He had this extraordinary relationship with crowds, which Disraeli couldn't do at all. So that's another advantage of Gladstone. It is quite true that both of them had scandalous private lives. And I really do think that one effect of tabloid journalism today, meaning that no Prime Minister can afford any scandal, has been to lower the quality, because I think on the whole people with scandalous lives are higher quality. I'm sure probably in some ways more intelligent, certainly risk takers, which is what we need. So Disraeli, in spite of all his early scandals, sharing his mistress with a conservative minister in order to get himself a job, Henrietta Sykes. In spite of all that, and in spite of being, I think today we'd call him a metrosexual, in spite of that, as a politician, his private life is actually pretty clean. And we compare this, as Dick said, with Gladstone, who goes out on these midnight prowls to redeem prostitutes and then flogs himself in a kind of sort of atonement. Gladstone undoubtedly would have fallen victim to the tabloids, and the world would have been a poorer place. I think that there is one thing where Disraeli has an advantage over Gladstone, and that is that Disraeli had great respect for party politics. I don't know about now, but then party politics really mattered. Party unity, party loyalty, the cult of party, tribal loyalties were hugely important in the second half of the 19th century. Gladstone had what we call an instrumentalist view of party. That is, if he wanted something, he would crash his party like a car. And so there was a car crash when he smashed his party over Home Rule for Ireland in 1886, just as Peel smashed his party over the Corn Laws in 1846, 40 years before. Disraeli would never have done that. Disraeli nurtured his party. He really kept the support of that group. And that, I think, was terribly important. It perhaps helps to balance Disraeli's lack of executive achievement. But perhaps finally, and I'm sorry, I'm going on too long, finally, 2 quick points. I think that in order to understand more about Disraeli's success, it's not just a matter of where he succeeds in the institutional landscape of the time. I think there are also sort of innate personal qualities we need to bring into leadership, which still apply today. And looking at Jonathan Powell's book, The New Machiavelli, Jonathan Powell, of course, applies this to Blair, but there are 2 criteria which Powell takes from Machiavelli, which are very simple: courage and intelligence. And by courage, he meant political courage, not necessarily personal courage, and by intelligence, emotional intelligence. And I think that Disraeli had both of these qualities in spades. And political courage is basically making difficult decisions. And I think no leader at any point who fudges the difficult decision will ever make it. I mean, from, Arthur Balfour in 1903, challenged by tariff reform, to Gordon Brown in 1907, not doing that election. That is both funking political courage decisions. Disraeli had huge political courage, and I mean, an example would be standing up in the House of Commons in 1847 when he really wants to be leader of the party and supporting the removal of Jewish disabilities. Coming out as a Jew was something which I think, only one example, but shows massive courage in him. And secondly, emotional intelligence, which is something also that is innate, and you either have it or you don't, and we can all think of examples possibly of prime ministers who do, and another rather recent prime minister who did not. But with Disraeli and Gladstone, just compare, as a quick example, their relationship with Queen Victoria. Gladstone would stand up and hector Queen Victoria. They both wanted the same thing. They both wanted her to appear more in public. But Gladstone's response was to stand up and lecture her. Disraeli's way of dealing with this issue was to flatter the Queen, lay it on with the trowel, call her the fairy queen. She was the most, say wonderful remarks like, "We authors, ma'am," which of course she swallowed, and of course she did everything he wanted. And that's about emotional intelligence, which is a key thing, I think, for any leader. So I'm saying really that it's not just a matter, leadership, of excelling in all these sort of charts that all these, political scientists draw. It is also a matter of some innate personal characteristics. You either have it or you don't.
Okay, you either have it or you don't. Stein, is that true?
Yes, it actually is, and it's part of a point I'd like to make. Let me just say that my credentials for being here is that I've just published a book on democratic leadership and the problem of obedience, under the title Nation of Devils. And in that book I visit many leaders, including many of the British leaders, but regrettably not the 2 that we are considering today. The devils in that title, by the way, are not the leaders who, as we know, are always doing their very best for us, but the rest of us here who are supposed to be followers. Now, the argument there is that leaders can get nothing done except through others, through their cooperation and acquiescence. Others being everyone from civil servants to ordinary citizens. They are at the mercy of those others who are always reluctant and who can always resist or subvert. To get anything done, they have to win over those reluctant others. Power in that game is only a certificate to rule. Once you are there in office, everything depends on how you use power so as to win over others. And that in turn depends on authority, which it is in the gift of others to award you or to deny you. Leadership is a matter of extracting authority from those you want to lead and then using that same authority back upon them to subduing them and making them followers. Now, in these days, we are reminded of Nelson Mandela, and through him of the relationship between leadership and personality. And in my review of many leaders, I find that this dimension of personality is overwhelmingly important, as we have been speaking about here. I recommend, for example, that political parties should, when they choose a leader, pay more attention to personality and leadership qualities than to whether the candidate stands here or there on the political spectrum. A rule that in this country, in particular the Labour Party, has had a habit of disobeying. Now, what fascinates us, I think, with the two leaders we are considering today is very much their contrasting personalities, as we have been speaking about. Gladstone, the rigid moralist, and Disraeli, the flamboyant extrovert. And I'm sure it's right that Gladstone stands the tallest in British political history of the two as a leader, but many of us do have a liking for Disraeli. I certainly do, for his social reforms, and I've linked those reforms in part to one part of his personality, that of being an outsider in the British establishment. That, by the way, was also the situation of the next great social reformer, Lloyd George, as Chancellor, and possibly even his then sidekick, a man by the name of Winston Churchill, whom you'll may be surprised to know that I consider one of the great social reformers in British political history. Now, Gladstone and Disraeli led in different ways. Gladstone more through his office or his offices, and Disraeli more through his person. And these are both difficult and risky ways of leading. The trouble with leading through your office, certainly in a modern democracy, is that it may not be enough. Here is a snippet from a biography of Edward Heath. Cecil King records how a colleague once called upon Heath and tried to persuade him to set up a propaganda department to explain his policies to the world. But no, replied Heath. His job was to govern, not to explain. That remarks a lot of Ted's, that explains a lot of Ted's mistakes, commented King. In a democratic age, after the revolution of expectations and the end of deference, it is, I think, impossible to extract authority by force of office only. But the trouble with leading through your person is that you lay yourself bare. Others are reluctant. They are looking for excuses to not make themselves followers. And when you offer yourself up, you show others things about yourself that they can use to belittle you. Gladstone said of Disraeli that he was all display without reality or genuineness. And that, of course, is exactly what was said of a later political leader who tried to lead through his person, and that is Mr. Tony Blair. Now, I don't think political leaders in a modern democracy have any choice. If they want to be effective, they have to have the personality for it, and they have to display that personality. It's difficult. I have no recipe for what personality is. It's personal. But you have to have it. And the case of Gordon Brown is illustrative. He just did not have that part of leadership in him, and it took him only a few months to destroy his own premiership. So I don't know what personality is, and it's possible that Gladstone had it, plenty of it in his way. But I know that the displaying of personality is a terribly difficult balance. And I think it was that balance that Mr. Blair got wrong, and that cost him both effectiveness as Prime Minister and later his reputation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stein. Andrew, how do you respond to all of this then?
I've not the faintest idea, actually. There's so many different points that have been raised, and Dick's brilliant opening presentation, and I thought both Stein and Jane had lots of interesting points to make. And I've also very dubious, I mean, as a part-time historian myself, very dubious about trying to draw lessons from history. I think it was A.J.P. Taylor who said that history doesn't repeat itself, historians just repeat each other. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. Of course, all historical figures are to a substantial extent a function of their time. How they might have adapted in different contexts, you'll never know because they were in their time. But for what it's worth, Gladstone, I thought, was in his own time a remarkably modern politician, which gives me confidence that he would have been able to modernise himself for contemporary politics. Well, he was brilliant at the soundbite. Brilliant. My mission is to pacify Ireland, which Dick cited. You cannot fight the future when fighting for the 1884 Reform Bill. The Turks should get out of Bulgaria bag and baggage. He would have been a brilliant tabloid editor, Gladstone. This idea that he could only make long speeches. He wrote very good short pamphlets and was extremely good at the one-liner. Conservatism, I'm trying to remember exactly what he said, but isn't it conservatism is self-interest tempered by fear, liberalism is optimism tempered by prudence. I mean, summing up the whole of politics in his day. He was also very modern in his use of contemporary media. He was the first Prime Minister, indeed party leader, to make frequent speeches in the country outside election time. I mean, the conventions, he broke all conventions. He was a great genius at innovation. The Midlothian campaign, I mean, Queen Victoria regarded this as unconstitutional. The idea that a party leader should go around the country, as William Whitelaw famously said, that he went around the country stirring up apathy. Well, Gladstone went up stirring up the most extraordinary passions in a whole form of very modern political campaign, with stenographers literally at the railway carriage as he arrived at all of these stations, going north to Edinburgh to fight this extraordinary election. And then, though he didn't do the same while he was Prime Minister, he did make significant speeches outside Parliament as Prime Minister. He was a very modern politician in many ways. But also, the contrast between him and Disraeli, I don't take to be one is the efficient one, who holds power by virtue of his office. Gladstone was an extraordinary personality. I mean, it was this extraordinary combination of personality and office, which Gladstone said. Gladstone's almost, I think, the last entry in his diary, which is a phenomenal document, is that he has spent his life immersed in working the institutions of his country. There was probably nobody in Victorian Britain who was better at working the institutions, and indeed, to a large extent in his case, creating the institutions of the Victorian state. It was this extraordinary combination of personality plus capacity to work institutions, which was remarkable about Gladstone. But it's not the case that, therefore, Gladstone is the efficient one and Disraeli is the one who achieves nothing. And if you look at the governments, though I agree, being temperamentally a Gladstonian myself, I do agree with Jane that Gladstone was a great reformer, but Disraeli was a pretty good reformer too. You can sleep through cabinet meetings and still preside over a government that achieves an enormous amount. The 1874 government was, as a Gladstonian myself, you have to say, it was a very considerable government. The Public Health Act of 1875 was arguably the single most significant piece of social reform in the second half of the 19th century. The Employers and Workmen Act, which finally effectively legalised unions, which Gladstone had refused to do, opened a whole new chapter in the history and potential of organised labour. And Sandon's Education Act, which made elementary education free, was another social revolution. Gladstone refused to do that because, being a liberal of the classical 19th century, thought he didn't believe in giving anything for nothing, and thought that the job of liberalism was to reduce, not to increase public spending. And of course, Disraeli, and Disraeli appointed Sandon. See, one of the most important things that leaders do, by the way, is to appoint other people. It's very important to understand that, having worked under two prime ministers. The capacity to organise and lead a team is vital. Those social reforms are Richard Cross, who was an absolutely inspired Disraeli appointment, done at the behest of the Earl of Derby, the great Lancashire magnate, who was himself a very considerable reformer, and at that stage a very close ally of Disraeli's. Disraeli knew what he was doing. He was putting and building a coalition. All leaders, by the way, who are successful build coalitions. the coalition of the stern unbending Tories, as Gladstone had called them, the political right, typified by the Marquis of Salisbury, who is brought back into the fold in 1874, first as Secretary of State for India, then as Foreign Secretary, who then becomes leader of the party afterwards, but then right through to the Earl of Derby and Richard Cross, who are essentially Whig modernising liberals. Sorry? 15th Earl of Derby, yeah. Who's a modernising liberal, and indeed defects to the Liberals and becomes a Gladstonian minister in the 1880s. And Richard Cross was an appointment there. Similarly, Disraeli revolutionised foreign policy as well. One of the most extraordinary achievements of his government was the Treaty of Berlin, and essentially a massive rolling back of Russian pretensions in the Near East. And he actually goes as the first Prime Minister personally to conduct an international negotiation abroad. He goes to Berlin. Now, in Douglas, there's a brilliant section in Douglas Hurd's biography of Disraeli of the Congress of Berlin, because, of course, Disraeli, amazingly, has no foreign languages and is very ill. And it's a miracle he gets there alive, and he has to be propped up in whatever it is, the hotel, what's the Adler, is that the one that he stays in? Where literally the first 2 days he is comatose and cannot move. And all of the detailed negotiations are done by Salisbury, who has to do them because... But Disraeli, you know, what is it that Bismarck says of Disraeli, the Jew, he is the man. Everybody realised, and part of the reason why this had happened was because of the great pose that Disraeli had struck before, which was a phenomenal act of leadership. A big red line in the sand. Russia was going to have to get out of... draw back from the very big advances that it had made in the Treaty of, San Stefano the year before, which is what had effectively set the whole term and the run-up to the Treaty of Berlin. And though he himself was incapable of conducting a negotiation because he couldn't speak the language and he was ill and he was tired and exhausted, nonetheless, he was animating by his personality and leadership the main contours of what happened. Now, I've seen this myself in time, because then to roll forward a century, I had a very interesting correspondence with Peter Hennessy when he was writing his book, very much in the line of other great books on prime ministers, on arguing, which I thought was completely fallacious, that the job of prime minister becomes so much more difficult than in the past. There was the 24-hour media, you had to work so much harder. The intensity was out of all proportion greater than it was before. To which my view, my considered view, which I feel even more strongly now having been in government and seen how prime ministers work, is that part of personality is, of course, leadership skills. Another part of personality is working style. Some people work hard and are workaholics, and that is how they exert authority and bring about big change. Sometimes they do so effectively, sometimes very ineffectively. I mean, I don't want to get personal here, but I've worked for a prime minister who was a workaholic who wasn't the most effective of prime ministers. I've also worked for a prime minister who was not remotely a workaholic, who virtually never did meetings after 6 o'clock in the evening unless there was an international crisis. He never did, a national crisis was never enough to get a meeting after 6 o'clock unless it was a really serious one that had to be attended to. He'd be on the phone, but he wouldn't do meetings because but was hugely effective. And this personality type alternates within each generation. The contrast between Alec Douglas Hume, I suppose, at one extreme, who was almost your archetypal laid-back prime minister, right through to Ted Heath, who was an absolute workaholic. John Major wasn't a particular workaholic, through to Mrs T. It often alternates. Well, you get that alternation between Gladstone and Disraeli, the workaholic. But what's so interesting about them is that in their own way they were supremely effective, but very, very different. And then that brings me, I suppose, to my final points, which is when I was discussing this with Peter Hennessy, I said that what does change, of course, is that I don't think the nature of politics changes. I don't think the nature of leadership changes, but the institutions and media within which you work, of course, do change. Gladstone's diaries are an extraordinary document, documenting how a prime minister who was a workaholic worked. In Gladstone's diaries, he parcels up his time by quarters of an hour, all the way through, from when he gets up right the way to when he goes to bed, describing what he's doing. What did he do? He wrote several dozen letters a day by hand, literally by hand, long, complicated letters on financial reforms. When he was preparing the Irish Home Rule Bill at the age of 83, he did it largely personally. Colossal correspondence between him and parliamentary draftsmen on the detailing of the bill. The job of his secretaries was to copy his letters, not to write them at all. When the House of Commons was sitting, the Prime Minister then in the 19th century was leader of the House of Commons. Now this again is quite telling. Gladstone pretty well every hour the House of Commons was sitting, which was half the year for 10 hours a day, sometimes more. And in the height of the Irish controversies of the 1880s, it was sitting literally for 2 or 3 days at a time. The Prime Minister was always there. When you read Hansard, when Parliament is sitting in the 19th century, almost every major debate is replied to by the Prime Minister, personally, as leader of the House of Commons. Sir William Harcourt, one of Gladstone's ministers, famously said, "When I am ill, I am in bed. When I am not, I am in the House of Commons." Now, Tony Blair appeared in the House of Commons for half an hour a week, literally. That was his parliamentary duty. I mean, he would occasionally make a statement. I can only remember 3 or 4 occasions where he opened a debate, and even then he would leave after the leader of the opposition had made the speech and then come back at the end of the debate 6 hours later. And just Gladstone's there the whole time. He also read voluminously. Gladstone's diaries include, his library has, 30,000 books, all personal annotations and all of that. I mean, he was a phenomenal reader, and working the institutions of the country, he was phenomenal in dialogue too, particularly on church matters. His diaries are he took being, effectively, he, as Prime Minister, probably the responsibility he took most seriously, apart from leading the House of Commons, was making appointments to the Church of England. Huge correspondence that Gladstone engages in on the personality of individual clerics who he's appointing. He regarded this as an important part of the role and was very important to the leadership of the Victorian state. Now, on Jane's point, how does Disraeli manage it as a hugely effective Prime Minister at setting leadership, the terms of the debate, the whole achievements of his government? When the House of Commons becomes too much for him, what does he do? He leaves and goes to the House of Lords. He knows physically he's just too infirm to carry on by 1876. He goes to the House of Lords, which he describes as the Elysian Fields. Where he doesn't have to make great speeches. I'm still there now. You don't have to, this is still very much a world apart from the House of Commons. So he adjusts the media to some extent, which is part of his brilliance, actually. He adjusts the media to suit and to craft it around his own personality and capacity, and in his case, capacity meaning literally physical capacity, because it was literally draining away from him by the late 1870s. And in that way, he was as creative about how to mediate leadership and vision through the institutions of the day and his own capacity, as was Gladstone. And in my experience, great leaders, it's this creativity that is their hallmark. You have a set of institutions, you have a set of media, you have a set of things that you want to do. They may be principled, they may be unprincipled, but you have an electorate out there, which is in the Victorian age still an important thing. And those who are, the Earl of Aberdeen was a disastrous Prime Minister and hated the job and gave up after 2 years and all of that. So lots of people failed at this job, as lots of people fail at contemporary politics. What marks out Gladstone and Disraeli is, in their own way, they were supremely successful, but a good part of their success was this extraordinary genius of creativity, which brings to mind, I think, probably the wisest remark, the most insightful remark that's been made of the office of Prime Minister, which was Asquith, who said that the office of Prime Minister is what the holder seeks and is able to make of it. And what both Gladstone and Disraeli, we talked about Tony Blair, Gordon Brown. But by the way, Gordon Brown was Prime Minister for 3 years. That's not bad. When you say he wasn't wholly temperamentally, I won't complete that sentence actually, it is possible to hold this office with almost any temperament. The question is as Asquith said, what you seek and are able to make of it. And genius is the capacity to make a great deal of it. And both Gladstone and Disraeli certainly succeeded in that respect.
Okay, thank you very much. Dick, was there anything that you wanted to come back on? I was particularly interested in... most of the discussion seems to have been around the personality and leadership qualities and their personal styles in terms of being able to make something of the role. As Andrew's just pointed out, the role is, still today, adaptable enough that particular individuals can make of it as they will, as Asquith said. But how important were these two figures in developing the role in the way that we understand it today, not just in terms of those qualities, leadership and so forth, but also in the powers of the Prime Minister vis-à-vis colleagues, vis-à-vis the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and perhaps I'll come back to Jane on this, and also against the monarch themselves.
Yes, well, I learned a lot by each of the three participants, and if I'd taught them before I wrote the book, no doubt it would have been a much better book. There's really just one point I would like to make, and that is on Jane, in fact, made a very big thing that Gladstone was much more successful as a Prime Minister than Disraeli. Andrew questions this to some extent. I think one great difference between them was that Gladstone was very much a government man. For the great majority of the time he was in the House of Commons, he was sitting on the government benches. He had 6 different jobs, ministerial jobs, before he became Prime Minister, including 9 years as Chancellor of the Exchequer. He hated being in opposition. He was very ineffective as a leader of the opposition. When he was leader of the opposition in the Commons under the Darby-Disraeli government, Disraeli ran rings round him and he easily defeated Gladstone's Reform Bill of 1866, which bloody well to have been passed. There was a Liberal majority in the House. It was Disraeli showed superb tactical skill, and Disraeli Gladstone didn't rise to his normal level on this. After he lost the election in 1874, he flounced out at the Liberal leadership on the basis he really wasn't interested in being leader of the opposition. He wrote an article, I think in the Quarterly Review, saying that any minister who's worth his salt can do 10 times as much good as a minister than he could otherwise. So he was basically in business. Although he twice resigned office for frivolous reasons, he saw himself as a minister who got things done. Now, Disraeli was not a great Prime Minister in the way that Gladstone was. As Andrew said, he distinguished himself in foreign policy during his second government. His achievement of getting the 1867 Reform Bill through the House when his party was in a minority was of a very great order. But as a leader of the opposition in the House, he was pretty effective. Very often he was restrained by the Earl of Derby. Disraeli was always looking for tactical possibilities of defeating Liberal and Whig governments by making deals with the Radicals and the Irish members and so on. And on the whole, the Earl of Derby restrained him from doing this. But tactically, he was a good leader of the opposition. The other thing about Disraeli is he made 1 or 2 strategic decisions of great importance, which showed, I thought, extraordinarily good judgment. Gladstone, during the course of his 1880 government, one of his Irish bills was defeated, I think, by only 2 or 3 votes, and he resigned. And the Queen needed no encouragement to get straight on to Disraeli and offer him the chance of forming the government. And to the general amazement, Disraeli turned it down. He had seen that 3 times Derby had led minority governments, and they hadn't been very happy experiments. He sensed that he had established a lead over the Liberals, and he thought if he held out to a general election, he would win. Everyone thought this was very odd. This is the last time that someone who's been offered forming a government has refused to do so. In retrospect, this was extremely good judgment on on Disraeli's part. The other thing I think was he bequeathed to his party this mixture of social reform and rumbustious foreign policy which he took over from Prime Minister, and which served the Tory party extraordinarily well. I mean, the reason why the Conservative Party was the predominant party throughout the 20th century owed itself basically to two men. One was the legacy it got from Disraeli, and the other was the legacy who got from the Marquis of Salisbury, who set himself. Salisbury thought that the union of the Whigs and the Radicals in the Liberal Party was an aberration. He thought the Whigs had the same economic interests in the Tories.
I was just going to say, before we do the whole of the 20th century, 19th, we need to move on to the audience. So, please do, yeah.
Salisbury set himself to split the Liberal Party so that the Whigs would come into the Tories. He achieved this in 1885, 1886 over Irish Home Rule. What he had not bargained was he would get the Radicals as well when Chamberlain and Dilke and the Earl of the 15th Earl of Derby came out. So I think these two men laid the foundation for the Tory dominance in the 20th century.
Thank you, Dick. Thanks. Okay, let's move on to questions to the audience. What I'll do is take three at a time and then come back to the panel briefly. So George here, and then at the back, and then the other one.
George Jones, LSE.
Can you just wait for the microphone? Sorry, George.
George Jones, LSE, co-author with Andrew Blake of a recent book, Power's Elbow, on the aids of Prime Ministers. And there's two important contrasts between these two men in the way in which they worked. One, Disraeli relied on one person, Montague Corrie, who was his private secretary, his alter ego, always there, all the time, heavily dependent on one man. He had some assistance from Treasury clerks, but it was a small outfit, and Corrie was dominant. Gladstone had a large outfit, many aides, secretaries from the civil service, you could say, spads almost, the younger sons of aristocrats who he relied on to hold his cabinet together. They were there. And his family. He had family to assist him. The other thing, Disraeli didn't get involved very much in detail. Gladstone did. In the running of the office, he told them how to file. He told them how to put documents with other documents and how to use paper clips. He was a great intervener. Disraeli, totally different. So how Prime Ministers led, they were very, very different in their office styles.
Okay, thank you, George. Okay, questions. I saw one just at the back there on the right, and then we'll move over to the left-hand side.
Robert Morland, I think in the context of what we're talking about, I'm a former Conservative member of the European Parliament and councillor. I have read Douglas Hurd's book, and one of the points he does make about Disraeli, and he's not obviously all that friendly towards Disraeli, is that he acted very pragmatically, that his reform bill, his social measures, etc., were not because he believed in them at all, because he thought they were good politics or good electorally. For example, we did touch on the Reform Bill of 1832, and he learnt the lesson of that. The Tories couldn't be on the wrong side there. And I wonder if I can bring it to more modern politics. I remember, because I'm old enough to remember, that people used to say for some time that the modern sort of equivalent of Disraeli was Harold Macmillan, who, of course, made very radical changes, particularly in foreign policy. I mean, we tend to... I was surprised we didn't hear more in the last few days of the fact that here he is, he goes to South Africa, stands up in the Parliament in 1960 and effectively makes a highly critical speech about apartheid. Although, there's no question that there would be a lot of dispute about that in British politics at the time, and he changed his foreign policy quite a bit. And the only difference I would have thought with Disraeli, it wasn't just in his terms good politics, he actually did believe in it, but the problem with Disraeli possibly was that, we do realise he didn't really believe it.
Okay, thank you. And then the gentleman at the back there, and then I'll come round for another round as well. I should also say, we've got people also watching in the innovation room. If they'd like to ask a question, please do come through, and someone will get you a microphone. Thank you.
Hello, my name's Martin Williams. I'm an official in Biz. My question or thought really is, from the outside, it looks to me as if Disraeli means something to modern conservatism in a way that I'm not quite conscious that Gladstone means anything to modern Labour or Liberal Party. For example, the concept of one nation Toryism. I'm not surprised to hear at a Conservative Party conference ministers stand up and talk about it. The idea of the conservative working man. Which is really a concept Disraeli created as opposed to the conservative peasant. You can talk about the spirit of Disraeli. Spirit of Gladstone? Does anyone talk about the spirit of Gladstone at Labour Party conference? Which says something about the way that Disraeli's character seems to resonate through in a rather curious way. And that's interested to know, A, if you agree, and B, why.
Okay, two different perspectives there. Perhaps I could turn back to the panel on that last point in particular. The ideological legacy of the two characters. Jane, can I start with you?
Well, yes, very quickly. One of the key points is that Disraeli never used the phrase one nation Toryism. This was Ed Miliband getting his history wrong. Disraeli talked about the two nations, the rich and the poor. He didn't say much about making them into one. But on the bigger point of Disraeli's importance, well, I'm absolutely delighted that Andrew should emerge as a Disraeli apologist. I'm obviously terribly keen on Disraeli as well. I think that we have here, as Andrew said, a perpetual divergence between different styles of leadership. And Disraeli, as has emerged from what we've been listening to, is very much an enabler, a delegator, somebody who stands back, but equally imaginative and constructive, whereas Gladstone is a sort of control freak, a man who is, has to do all the work himself, does a lot of it very well, but is not very good at sharing power. And I think that this really interesting point that Andrew made also about the ways in which they imaginatively used the position of Prime Minister and personality issues. I mean, I think we have to remember also that this can so easily tip into what has been called hubris, when you get politicians who have been there too long, as Gladstone was in his last ministry, or Thatcher, or even possibly Blair over Iraq. And that amazing personality issue sort of tips over into egotistical politics that lead nowhere. Did Disraeli have beliefs? Yes, I think he did, but he kept them very close to his chest, and they were mainly about the Conservative Party.
Andrew, any thoughts on that?
Well, Disraeli certainly believed that he should be in government and he should be famous. Yeah. did he believe anything much else? Fame is what Disraeli sought. It comes through so clearly from the Douglas Hurd biography and his own writing about himself. What he sought was fame. Actually, fame. He didn't much care for posthumous fame either. He didn't really have any religious beliefs. It was fame in his lifetime he wanted, and therefore the whole thing was constructed so he could be great and famous, and he succeeded spectacularly. Is there any other legacy? I mean, the one nation stuff, as Jane rightly says, is a load of nonsense in the sense of being a blueprint for how you conduct a modern social or economic policy. But it's good. I mean, the slogan was implicit. It was used, though it's true that Disraeli himself doesn't use it. It's used at the time and is regarded as his great legacy. And it does point to an important attitude of conservatism, which Dick brings out strongly, which is that the Conservative Party can't simply cling to the past. It's got to be able to reconcile itself with the present. And that was in the context of European conservatism in the 19th century, that was quite a development, because there was quite a lot of 19th century conservatives spent their time clinging to the past and trying to work out how they could reconcile as much as possible of the old order with as little as possible of the modern order, which after all was in some ways Lord Salisbury's great triumph. I never forget the story of Salisbury at Hatfield House, found by his wife sleepwalking and literally on the balcony, and she has to drag him back, and he has his hands out to the night air, shouting out at the top of his voice, "Democracy, democracy, stand back." That was the Salisbury, it was the Metternich view of the world, it was the, to a large extent, the Bismarck view of the world. It was a big part of 19th century conservatism, and Disraeli he was a much more subtle politician than that. As for Gladstone, it's true that partly because the Liberal Party itself, of course, is withered in the... And of course, part of what parties do is they always hark back to their leaders in the past, even if everything has changed, because everybody needs household gods. And so if the Liberal Party had been a significant party in the 19th and early 20th century, then everybody, Liberal leaders who would have been Prime Minister, would have spent all their time reinterpreting everything they're doing in the light of Gladstone's great legacy. Part of the reason it doesn't happen is the Liberal Party institutionally becomes so weak in the 20th century. But nonetheless, talk of Mr. Blair, ethical foreign policy, liberal interventionism, a lot of that is straight out of the Gladstone copybook, and indeed when the Chicago speech, the doctrine of international obligation, which is one of the defining moments of the Blair premiership, that, as people did say at the time, and because they did look back, there's a lot of commentary at the time about how this is straight out of the Midlothian campaign and Gladstone's attempt to forge, with only mixed success, of course, in practice, as Tony Blair found, to forge what he was regarded in the spirit of the time as being an ethical foreign policy seeking to stand up for the oppressed and to enunciate a doctrine of international order and intervention against oppressors. So there is a Gladstonian legacy that I think is distinct and significant, and in the context of Ireland, of course, also discussed too. So there's a big legacy there that there isn't institutionalised in a party that's still significant, which is different from Disraeli, nonetheless does speak to a number of perennial concerns of modern politics.
Okay, I'm going to hold forth and give the audience another round, just because I'm conscious of time and I want to make sure that we get everyone gets a go. Can I start with Bill Keegan, just in front here? Thank you.
Thank you, William Keegan, The Observer. Not a question, three very quick points. I think the One Nation, Two Nation, it was really, the One Nation was popularised by the wet Tories after 79 in reaction to Mrs Thatcher. It was people like my old friend Lord Gilmore and Peter Walker, Jim Pryor and co. And they formed a One Nation group. On Gordon Brown, I think it's a bit unfair to dismiss the premiership in 3 months. He was the right man there when the financial crisis came. He may not have done very well at home, but he's acknowledged internationally for having been crucial to saving the international financial system in 2008-9. Third small point, Andrew's reference to fame being the spur. I seem to recall there was a novel, I think it was by Howard Spring, some decades ago, called Fame as the Spur, and that was all about political ambition. Okay, no questions.
Thank you. More comments? Oh, is it? Okay, another couple over in this area. Yes, gentleman there.
Thanks. I'm a former colleague of Dick's in the House of Commons many years ago, Michael Barnes. I'd like to ask the panel, do they think that the demands and pressures in the role of Prime Minister nowadays inevitably lead Prime Ministers to act in a quasi-presidential role, both in their relations with the world at large and with their relations with the Cabinet? Or do the panel think that it's just possible in the years ahead there might again be a Prime Minister who sees his or her role more in terms of the chair of a committee, first among equals? I mean, I think you could say that probably of Attlee and of Macmillan. And that, to me, has always seemed to be the true constitutional nature of the role, rather than what we've had in recent years from some PMs.
Okay, and then another one there, the gentleman behind, just behind. Thank you.
Hans van Leeuwen is my name. On a similarly quasi-presidential question, I guess another difference between Prime Ministers now and then is now you only get one shot. Once you've been Prime Minister, you leave office and often move somewhat out of public life or partly. Whereas Prime Ministers in the 19th century often would have a spell out of being Prime Minister and come back again. I'd ask the panel to speculate on what effect that might have on you as Prime Minister, that the knowledge that you might come back again, or that you've come back again and you can learn from your previous time. And also ask why that took place. Winston Churchill, I think, was the last British Prime Minister to go into opposition and come back, but why doesn't that happen anymore? Wilson, yeah, of course. Okay, so it's fairly recent, but it feels like it's a change, and I'm wondering why that's taken place.
Okay, we'll get one more in, just because Bill King didn't actually ask questions, so thank you.
John Strafford, if the consensus is now that Disraeli's One Nation was nonsense, why do you think Ed Miliband is resurrecting it?
Okay, very contemporary. Let's start over here with Stein then. Particularly, I mean, this one about the demands now and presidential role. I mean, it seems more like actually from Gladstone and Disraeli, from what we've been hearing about them, that they had equally a almost quasi-presidential role.
Yes, I'll come to that, but I want to comment on Disraeli. Okay. I mean, the reason that legacy is there is that the legacy is there. I mean, he may or may not have believed in the reforms, but the reforms that were produced under his premiership were absolutely monumental, the social, labour, educational reforms. So that reform spirit was very important. I think it was much more than keeping up with the times and changing enough to preserve. These were genuine, monumental, great social reforms that were pushed through. And it may not matter very much whether Disraeli believed in them himself, but they were monumental reforms which are there as part of his legacy. Now, the demands on the office of leader is, of course, they're very harsh, but they're also very much what the leader himself or herself make of them. And if you are a control freak, it's absolutely horrendous. But if we take one of the most effective political leaders in recent time, Ronald Reagan, he was the opposite of a control freak. He didn't work very hard. He went upstairs for an afternoon nap at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and his working day was pretty much over. And he didn't operate as a control freak. And there's an enormous contrast in style between him and Mrs. Thatcher at the same time. Same kind of policy, same kind of mission, but very, very different ways of leading. And not one was more, for that reason, more effective than the others. So it's very, very much dependent on the personality. And it is quite possible that the situation will come back where we have a prime minister in this country who is more a leader of the team. That depends very much on whether one is able to reintroduce some form of real and effective cabinet government, something that has been destroyed since the time of Mrs. Thatcher. Now, persons, we've talked a lot about it, and I think there's great agreement that personality matters, but also that what that personality is enormously different. I mean, you can't really pin down what the recipe is for having the personality of leadership. In the end, I think Tony Blair did not. It's an interesting question to reflect on whether Mr. Cameron, who is now in office, does. And I suspect, from what it looks like, so far at least, that his premiership will go down as a very effective one from the point of view of the Conservative Party. And that he has been able to lead a coalition government in a way that has made it a very effective Conservative government. And and that may very well, when we look back on it in a bit of time, come back to his personality.
Some disagreement from the audience. Jane, any final thoughts on all of this?
Well, no, I'm interested in this. I mean, I'm interested actually to see what Andrew and Dick would have to say about this shift from prime ministerial government to presidential government. It's interesting too that it seems to coincide with the fact that party was incredibly important, and the tribal value, and really important, well, what up until mid-20th century. But certainly in the 19th century, Disraeli and Gladstone were working against a background of party having huge prestige and growing value. Now party has lost its appeal and its membership. And yet we have this presidential system, and we also have a system perhaps where we have much less respect for politicians. So these two things seem to sit rather oddly with each other. Declining respect for politics and interest and commitment to party, with increasing power for these sort of quasi-presidential figures, and also this completely built-in assumption that if you lose, a Prime Minister loses an election, you're out and you'll resign, which doesn't happen in the 19th century. I mean, I don't know what your views are on this.
I don't buy this argument that somehow there used to be this great era of cabinet government where leaders were collegiate, they presided over the cabinet, they were much more constitutionally minded, they allowed other people to speak their mind, they didn't have strong views, and then suddenly when Mrs Thatcher came along, all this changed, the handbag was waved and presidential government arrived. Both Gladstone and Salisbury were widely criticised in their own day, including by their own colleagues, for being dictators. What they also did, which no Prime Minister could do in the contemporary times, it just isn't physically possible, at least I don't think it's physically possible, but maybe somebody will disprove that soon, is they both were so concerned to exercise the levers of power that mattered to them. They occupied more than one office. Apart from his last government, when he was literally too infirm to do so, Gladstone was always Prime Minister and Chancellor, because he saw the two posts as being integrally connected, and his mission, a good part of his mission, was financial reform and management. So he saw that it was vital. He presented, in incredible detail. He got involved in he was a real chancellor. He wasn't a notional chancellor, he was Prime Minister. Incredible detail he got into on fiscal policy, tax reform and all of that. Lord Salisbury was always Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary. He made what he regarded as the biggest mistake of leadership when he first became Prime Minister in 1885, when he allowed Stafford Northcote to become Prime Minister, so become Foreign Secretary. He was about to sack him, then Stafford Northcote, knowing he's about to be sacked, has a heart attack in Salisbury's outer office, whereupon Salisbury literally, saying it famously, looking at the dead body of Stafford Northcote, politics is a cursed profession. Well, he certainly did make it cursed in the way he treated Stafford Northcote, but then he assumed the office of Foreign Secretary, and this was hugely important. This is the period of Britain's greatest imperial outreach, which is almost entirely conducted by Salisbury as Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary, barely consulting the Cabinet, who had no idea what was going on in these big international negotiations that he was undertaking. Only at the very end, in 1900, when he becomes too infirm, does he give up the Foreign Secretaryship. And Salisbury was also famously short-sighted. He couldn't recognise most of his colleagues. Part of the reason why he made so few changes in his government was because he didn't want new people around him, because he didn't know who they were. And so his cabinets, all the way through from 1885 right through to his retirement in 1902, were largely the same people, including people of the utmost mediocrity, who were there all the way through because he was familiar with them. And another great Salisbury epigram, which is when he was asked why it was he was always Foreign Secretary as well as Prime Minister, he said, there are only two offices that matter in this country, Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary, and that's why I hold them both. So this idea that we had this great era of cabinet government then is, I'm afraid, totally mythical. And I've served Prime Minister, and indeed, if I look at the Blair government, what's interesting about it when you come to look at it, understanding how power was exercised in it, is that there were periods of extreme presidentialism. There were also periods of extreme cabinetism, whatever you want to call it. There was never just one power centre in the Blair government either. The Brown Treasury was an extremely powerful and important power centre, and in other periods there were other power centres too. It is not the case that the cabinet didn't matter under Tony Blair. At some periods it didn't matter. At other periods, particularly the period around Iraq, and the later period where Tony Blair was in extreme tension with Gordon Brown, cabinet meetings got a lot longer. They often went on for 2.5, 3 hours, and the reason they went on for so long was because Blair could only govern and could only maintain a control over, a lead over policy by working in quite an elaborate way, actually. It was an elaborate operation through the cabinet. So the conclusion I draw from all this is that, it comes back to Stein's point, is that it's this interplay of personality and institution, and institutions and media. It's the three. It's personality, institutions, and media. It's that interplay which is what determines the effectiveness of leadership and the substance of power. And it's a very delicate interplay between those three, and I don't think it's substantially changed over time.
Okay, Dick, you have the final word.
Yes. Well, just a couple of points. First of all, why isn't Gladstone still remembered in the same way as Disraeli is? I think the explanation should be, the question should be, why is Disraeli still seen as someone whom one wants to emulate? Gladstone was widely admired for a long time after he departed the scene in the early 20th century and even in the 1920s. Virtually every Liberal and Labour politician looked up to Gladstone, often cited his name. I don't think it's all that odd that over 100 years after Gladstone's death he's not remembered. There was just one little shadow of this after the last election when the Liberal Party, Liberal Democrats, which had posed as a left of centre party during the election campaign, abandoned its policies and joined a very right-wing government. The so-called yellow group around Nick Clegg, who were very concerned about having a balance in the budget and this sort of thing. I think they might have cried Gladstone in aid. On the question of cabinet government, I think that John Major, at least in the early days of his government, did try and restore it. You know, certainly cabinet meetings went on much longer and were held more frequently under Major than they had been under Mrs. Thatcher. Why do unsuccessful leaders feel they have to stand down now? I think it's largely because there is now a democratic way in all the parties of electing and removing leaders. In the 19th century, this was not the case, and if a leader wanted to cling on, it was extremely difficult to get rid of him. I think the position now is that you might be able to survive one defeat. Neil Kinnock survived without one defeat. I don't think you can survive two defeats. Ted Heath tried to, but by that time, the leadership of the party was decided by a ballot of MPs, and he came a cropper. So I think, you know, depending on the circumstances of how you lose, if you do relatively well but still lose, you might be all right. If it has been expected you're going to win and you lose, you're out straight away. But two defeats and that's it.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. It only remains for me to ask you all to thank the panel. Thank you all very much for coming.